What if the church you fear most is quietly fighting for lives? In America, conversations about suicide are often shaped by fear, silence, or polarization. When religion enters the discussion, especially Catholicism, the assumption is almost automatic: condemnation, rigid moral rules, and closed doors. Yet this assumption collapses under closer examination. The Catholic Church's teaching on suicide, particularly as lived and expressed in contemporary American Catholicism, reveals a tension-filled but deeply human position, one that insists on the sanctity of life while refusing to reduce a person to their darkest moment. To understand this position, one must begin not with prohibition, but with theology. In Catholic belief, life is not a personal possession. It is a sacred gift, given by God, entrusted to human care, but never fully owned. This distinction is crucial. Ownership implies absolute control. Stewardship implies responsibility. A human being is therefore not the author of life's beginning nor its final arbiter. This belief forms the foundation of Catholic moral teaching and explains why suicide has historically been considered morally unacceptable. The Church teaches that suicide contradicts the commandment "you shall not kill," but not in a simplistic or mechanical sense. The commandment is understood as a call to protect life in all its vulnerability, including one's own. Suicide also represents, in Catholic theology, a rupture of hope. It is seen as a moment when trust in God's providence collapses under the weight of suffering. Additionally, the Church recognizes that suicide inflicts profound wounds on families, friends, and entire communities, creating a ripple of grief that extends far beyond the individual. Yet this is only the first layer of the teaching, and focusing solely on it distorts the full picture. Catholic tradition has long insisted on a careful distinction between the moral evaluation of an act and the moral responsibility of the person who commits it. This distinction is not a modern concession but a core principle of Catholic moral theology. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, particularly paragraphs 2280 through 2283, articulates this balance with striking clarity. Objectively speaking, suicide is described as a grave moral disorder. The language is unambiguous. And yet, almost immediately, the Catechism introduces a second, equally important dimension: subjective responsibility. Psychological disturbances, grave fear, suffering, anguish, and severe mental illness can significantly diminish, or even eliminate, personal culpability. This is not a loophole. It is a theological statement about the human condition. The Church acknowledges that freedom can be wounded. Rational judgment can be clouded. The will itself can be impaired by illness or despair. In such cases, the moral weight of the act cannot be assessed in isolation from the interior state of the person. From this follows one of the most misunderstood aspects of Catholic teaching: the Church does not declare that a person who dies by suicide is condemned to hell. In fact, it explicitly refuses to make such judgments. Instead, it entrusts the person to the mercy of God, whose understanding surpasses human categories of guilt and innocence. The Catechism affirms that God can provide opportunities for repentance even in moments unknown to us. This refusal to pronounce final judgment is not theological ambiguity. It is theological humility. In the American Catholic context, this humility has shaped a significant pastoral shift over the past several decades. While the doctrinal principles remain unchanged, the language, emphasis, and practical response have evolved. Across dioceses, parishes, and Catholic institutions in the United States, there is a visible movement away from abstract moral condemnation and toward concrete pastoral care. This shift is evident in how priests are trained. Seminaries increasingly include education on mental health, depression, trauma, and suicide prevention. Clergy are taught not to replace therapists, but to recognize warning signs, to listen without panic, and to guide individuals toward professional help. The message is clear: seeking therapy or medication is not a failure of faith. It is often an act of responsibility and courage. Catholic parishes in the United States now frequently host support groups for those who have lost loved ones to suicide. These groups are spaces where grief is not spiritualized away or silenced by shame. Instead, pain is acknowledged, named, and shared. Families are reminded that their loved one's life mattered, that their suffering mattered, and that their grief does not isolate them from the Church. Homilies addressing mental health, once rare, have become increasingly common. Priests speak openly about depression, anxiety, and despair, not as moral failures but as human experiences that require compassion and support. Catholic universities and hospitals have become active participants in suicide prevention initiatives, integrating faith-based ethics with modern psychological care. What emerges from this landscape is not a church abandoning its moral convictions, but a church insisting that moral truth must always be spoken in the language of love. The prohibition of suicide is not framed as a threat, but as a declaration that every life, even a suffering one, has value beyond what pain can obscure. Central to this perspective is the belief that no person is defined by their final act. Catholic theology resists reductionism. A human being is a story, not a snapshot. Suffering, even when overwhelming, does not erase dignity. Tragedy does not nullify a lifetime of love, struggle, and meaning. For families left behind, this teaching offers something rare in public discourse: hope without denial. The Church prays for the dead, including those who have died by suicide, not as a symbolic gesture, but as an expression of trust in God's mercy. Funerals are permitted. Mourning is accompanied, not stigmatized. The door is not slammed shut. This approach reflects a deeper theological conviction: mercy is not opposed to truth. Mercy is the way truth is lived when human weakness is real. Catholicism insists that defending life and showing compassion are not competing values. They are inseparable. At the heart of the Church's message in America today is a quiet but firm assertion: silence kills, isolation deepens despair, and judgment without understanding wounds further. Faith, when authentic, does not retreat from human suffering. It enters it, accompanies it, and insists that help is not a betrayal of belief, but one of its highest expressions. American Catholicism today exists at the intersection of doctrine and lived experience. While the theological principles regarding the sanctity of life remain unchanged, the pastoral reality has forced the Church to confront suffering not as an abstract concept, but as a daily presence in parishes, schools, hospitals, and families. Suicide is no longer discussed only in moral manuals, but in hospital rooms, parish offices, and grieving living rooms. In this context, the Church in the United States has increasingly adopted a pastoral language that prioritizes accompaniment over admonition. This does not mean moral relativism. It means recognizing that people in suicidal crisis are often not making free, calculated choices, but are acting under the weight of unbearable psychological pain. The Church responds not by lowering the value of life, but by raising the level of care. Catholic pastoral psychology emphasizes listening as a moral act. To listen without interruption, without immediate correction, and without fear is seen as a way of restoring dignity to a person whose inner world feels chaotic or invisible. In many American parishes, priests and pastoral workers are trained to recognize that silence, withdrawal, or sudden behavioral changes may be cries for help rather than signs of moral failure. This approach has reshaped how Catholic leaders speak publicly about suicide. Homilies increasingly avoid abstract condemnation and instead focus on God's closeness to the brokenhearted. Biblical language of lament, endurance, and hope is used to create space for honesty rather than shame. The goal is not to offer quick answers, but to reassure believers that suffering does not exile them from God. A crucial aspect of the American Catholic response is collaboration with mental health professionals. Catholic hospitals, clinics, and universities play a significant role in integrating faith-based ethics with modern psychology and psychiatry. This cooperation is grounded in the conviction that grace does not replace nature, but works through it. Therapy and medication are therefore not viewed as competitors to faith, but as instruments through which healing may occur. For families who have lost a loved one to suicide, the Church's role becomes particularly delicate. Grief in such cases is often complicated by guilt, unanswered questions, and social stigma. Catholic pastoral care seeks to counter isolation by reaffirming that mourning is not a weakness, and that love does not end with death. The Church's presence is meant to communicate that the family is not alone and not judged. Catholic funeral rites reflect this theology of hope. While suicide is acknowledged as a tragedy, the liturgy focuses on God's mercy rather than moral verdicts. Prayers for the deceased are offered not as denial of reality, but as acts of trust in a God whose justice is inseparable from compassion. In this way, the Church resists the temptation to turn funerals into moral lessons, choosing instead to make them moments of collective healing. The wider parish community is also called to responsibility. Catholic teaching emphasizes that despair often grows in isolation, and that indifference can become a silent accomplice to suffering. Parishioners are encouraged to notice changes in behavior, to reach out rather than retreat, and to treat vulnerability not as discomfort to avoid, but as a call to solidarity. In American Catholic universities, the conversation has expanded further. Campus ministries regularly address mental health, stress, and suicide prevention, especially in environments where academic pressure and social isolation are common. These efforts reinforce the message that faith does not demand emotional invulnerability, but invites honesty and mutual care. The Church's insistence on hope is not naive optimism. It is grounded in a theological vision that sees human life as meaningful even when it feels broken. Catholic theology does not promise a life without pain, but it rejects the idea that pain renders life disposable. Hope, in this sense, is not the denial of suffering, but the refusal to let suffering have the final word. This vision shapes the Church's involvement in suicide prevention initiatives across the United States. Dioceses partner with local organizations, promote crisis hotlines, and encourage conversations that reduce stigma. The underlying message is consistent: seeking help is not a failure of faith, but a recognition of one's own humanity in need for support. At its core, the Catholic approach in America insists on holding two truths together. Life is sacred and must be protected. Human beings are fragile and must be accompanied. Removing either truth distorts the message. When held together, they form a response that is firm without being cruel, and compassionate without being empty. This balance is perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of Catholic teaching on suicide. Outsiders often hear only the prohibition, while believers themselves sometimes struggle to reconcile doctrine with lived pain. Yet the Church's long moral tradition insists that love without truth is sentimentality, and truth without love becomes violence. The American pastoral experience has made this tension visible, human, and unavoidable. The result is a Catholic voice that speaks slowly and carefully in a culture accustomed to extremes. It refuses to glorify death or to explain it away. Instead, it points persistently toward life, community, and mercy, even when answers are incomplete and wounds remain open. The final question the Catholic Church in America faces is not only what it teaches about suicide, but how it chooses to stand beside those who live in its shadow. Doctrine alone cannot carry grief, and moral language alone cannot heal despair. What emerges instead is a pastoral vision shaped by proximity to suffering, one that insists the Church must be present where pain is most acute, even when answers are incomplete. Catholic theology does not interpret suffering as meaningless, but neither does it romanticize it. Pain is not treated as a spiritual achievement, nor is endurance demanded without support. Instead, suffering is acknowledged as a reality of the human condition that requires response, care, and shared responsibility. The Church's moral authority, in this sense, is expressed less through declarations and more through accompaniment. At the heart of this response lies a conviction that despair distorts perception. When a person is overwhelmed by depression or fear, the future collapses into the present moment, and hope becomes inaccessible. Catholic teaching recognizes this not as rebellion against God, but as a wound of the mind and spirit. This recognition shapes how responsibility is understood and why judgment is withheld. This is why the Church insists that no human being can declare the final destiny of another soul. Salvation is not a legal verdict issued by institutions, but a mystery entrusted to divine mercy. By refusing to pronounce eternal judgment on those who die by suicide, the Church affirms that God's reach extends beyond human comprehension, even into moments of darkness we cannot see. For survivors, this theological restraint becomes a source of quiet consolation. Families are not asked to defend the memory of their loved one, nor to explain what cannot be explained. Instead, they are invited to mourn honestly, to grieve without fear of exclusion, and to trust that love does not end where understanding fails. The Catholic emphasis on prayer for the dead reflects this hope. These prayers are not attempts to rewrite the past, but acts of solidarity that affirm the enduring bond between the living and the deceased. In praying, the community confesses its limits and entrusts what it cannot heal to God's mercy. Equally important is the Church's insistence that prevention is a moral obligation. To speak about suicide only after tragedy is to arrive too late. Catholic communities in America increasingly frame prevention as an expression of love for life, calling believers to notice loneliness, to break silence, and to treat mental health struggles with the same seriousness as physical illness. This preventive vision rejects the false opposition between faith and science. Catholic teaching affirms that human reason, medical knowledge, and psychological care are gifts that serve life. Seeking therapy, medication, or crisis intervention is not seen as a lack of trust in God, but as cooperation with the means through which healing often comes. The Church's language around courage has also shifted. Strength is no longer defined as silent endurance, but as the willingness to ask for help. In this view, reaching out becomes an act of moral bravery, a refusal to surrender to isolation, and a step toward reclaiming one's own dignity. American Catholic leaders increasingly emphasize that communities must become places where vulnerability is safe. When people fear judgment, they hide their pain. When they are met with patience and respect, they speak. The Church's task, therefore, is not to eliminate suffering, but to ensure that no one suffers alone. This approach challenges both secular and religious extremes. It rejects cultural narratives that frame suicide as autonomy or escape, and it rejects religious narratives that reduce complex human suffering to moral failure. What remains is a difficult middle path, one that holds life as sacred while acknowledging the fragility of those entrusted with it. In the American context, where conversations about mental health are increasingly public yet often polarized, the Catholic voice offers a measured alternative. It speaks neither in absolutes nor in silence, but in careful language shaped by centuries of moral reflection and contemporary pastoral experience. Ultimately, the Catholic position on suicide in America is not a message about death, but about life. It is about protecting life when it feels least valuable, defending dignity when it seems most fragile, and choosing mercy when judgment would be easier. The Church's refusal to abandon hope is not denial of tragedy. It is an act of fidelity to the belief that no darkness is absolute and no suffering has the final word. This hope is extended not as certainty, but as invitation, offered gently to those who can barely hold it. In closing, the Catholic faith in America speaks about suicide with restraint, compassion, and resolve. It defends the sanctity of life without forgetting the weight of suffering. It calls for responsibility without withdrawing mercy. And it insists, again and again, that love must remain present even when answers do not. Finally, the Church encourages those who struggle to speak, to seek help, and to trust that their lives matter beyond what pain suggests. For viewers in the United States, resources such as the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline exist to offer immediate support. Seeking help is not weakness. It is an affirmation that life is worth protecting.